Hello everybody, welcome to Snyder's Inc. And today we got a Savox video here, and this is 10 of the most evil police officers. Oh boy! Oh boy! I might feel like this is one of those videos that will get a bunch of controversy towards things, because anytime I do, I have some people who are just complete and other dumbasses try to defend police, or I have police officers themselves. I've had a few that have commented on it, so we'll see how this goes. But ladies and gentlemen, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and comment what you think of these 10 officers down below. If you'd like to help me out with a donation, because I don't think this video will get monetized, so if you want to help me out with a donation, you can leave a super thanks, or link to my PayPal is in the description. Let's go.
The task of law enforcement is one that has existed in some way, shape or form in every society from the beginning of civilization. For as long as we as people have had laws, we have had people in place to make sure that these laws are enforced and taking on those who choose to disobey them. And for all that time, and for as many people that have taken on this important, dangerous and often thankless task, there are those who have gone into wanting only to serve themselves. People who have blatantly
I only know one officer that should be on here, and I think it's this one corrupt officer that literally had, faked a bunch of evidence and got a bunch of, people arrested for crimes they didn't commit. I don't remember what his name was.
Repeatedly and flagrantly broken the very laws that they swore to uphold. Whether it's cops on the beat taking bribes to turn a blind eye, or agents getting a little too involved in their undercover roles, it's always been a shadowy spectre lurking in the halls of every police.
Ooh, that one sounds intriguing. Agents who have got too into the undercover roles and committed crimes. If you go give me some of them, you have my attention, because I'm curious for that one.
Station and walking the streets in a uniform. While it may seem that recently we have heard more about those that have done great wrong to others while wearing a badge, this isn't going to be a condemnation of every single person that's ever worn a uniform. Instead, it's a look at 10 of the absolute worst people who have ever committed terrible crimes, who also happen to be police officers. So yeah, just so we're clear, I do not believe that all cops are bad. The vast majority of them do their job properly, which is to protect the public. This video is about a few of the minority who actually are bad. Here are 10 of...
I always believe that too. I believe there's always good cops out there. I've tried to do a ride-along with an officer that I know specifically who's a good cop, to show what a day is like with him, but I could never, he fell off the earth and didn't stop answering me. I don't know what happened there.
The most evil police officers.
Justin Volpe.
It's a sad reality that it wouldn't take most of us long to remember an instance of police brutality. The beating of Rodney King, captured on video in March of 1991, served as a spark for a series of riots that set the streets of LA on fire. Such flagrant and excessive force being used against a helpless victim, recorded for the world to see, ignited anger in the public, and a demonstration of just how unhappy they were with these constant abuses. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be difficult to fill this list with incidents like the first one, but instead, we're looking at one of the most egregious examples of violence meted out by a person who was supposed to be upholding the law. Justin Volpe was born in March of 1972 in Brooklyn, New York, and moved to Staten Island alongside his parents and two older brothers while he was still young. Law enforcement seemed to run in the family. His father was an artist, as was his mother, but decided to become a police officer, where he would combine these two passions by becoming well respected within the niche world of art theft. Retiring after a successful career, Justin's older brother also joined the force. It was little surprise then that Justin followed suit and signed up in his early 20s, starting out at the end of 1993. His conduct and capability within the force was entirely pedestrian. No noted issues with his behavior or conduct that stuck out, and entirely acceptable, if not overly impressive arrest stats. This was all to change on the 9th of August 1997, when Volpe and other officers responded to reports of a fight that had broken out near a club in Brooklyn. When they arrived, the scuffle spilled over and a melee formed with the 4 responding officers and nightclub patrons, many of whom claimed that they were simply trying to defuse the initial fight. In the confusion, Justin claimed that a man named Abner Louima had assaulted him. He placed him under arrest for a litany of charges, including resisting arrest and disorderly conduct, and put him into a police vehicle to transport him back to the precinct to be booked. And for Abner, being taken into custody was just the very beginning of a nightmare. Even on the ride back to the precinct, he was already being subjected to physical violence by Justin and others. Testimony and evidence would show that he was being hit by pretty much any blunt instrument that they had to hand: radios, batons, and flashlights.
Do you mean like radios and like their own radios? Like that type of radio? Or do you mean like they grabbed a radio out of a car and just started smacking him with it? Because if it's the second one, that's some next level violent shit. Like, he pulled the radio off his own car and smack. I don't think that's what they meant, but that's what they meant. They pulled the radio off the car and just started smacking him with it.
Once back at the station, the beating continued for a prolonged period. He was stripped and placed in a holding cell, and for much of the assault, his hands were restrained and he was unable to mount a reasonable defense. The worst was to come when Volpe, and possibly an as yet unidentified additional officer or officers, took Abner to the bathroom and committed the most extreme act of the entire event. The details of what Justin did to him are graphic, but should be specified to fully understand just how bad this assault was. Justin used a broomstick handle to forcibly sodomize him, using enough force that it inflicted permanent damage to Abner's internal organs. He then
This is number one. I don't know how you taught this. I don't know how you beat this. How is this 10? That is... I feel like the rest of these are going to be like killers, right? I guess I'm going to assume that's why he's 10. He didn't kill the dude. I think this is worse. This is worse than this. Than killing someone. There is a part of me that feels like this is the worst crime than murder. I'm just gonna be honest here. What this guy did to this dude, there's some because if you when you kill someone, right? In the case of like if you're on duty and you're dealing with a scuffle and you kill someone, even if they're in the, you could somehow make. I mean, you were just in the frenzy, right? For you to plan this out in a prison, you have to have some. You gotta have some evil fucking mindset. How has this guy gone this long without being like this? There was no way this is the first time this guy just happened to do this. There's no fucking way. I'm sorry. I know I'm probably talking for too long. I am baffled. I heard what I heard and my brain has not processed what I heard.
Then shoved the broken handle into Abner's mouth, damaging his teeth, which also required extensive medical intervention at a later date. This was in addition to having grasped his testicles while Abner was handcuffed. Far from feeling ashamed of his actions, Justin walked through the hallways with the still dirty broom handle, boasting of what he had done. However, it soon became apparent that the extent of the injuries suffered by the victim were more severe than the officers had anticipated. They took Abner to the hospital, where they tried to explain away his rectal injuries as being the result of consensual homosexual encounters in his private life. The medical staff, recognizing what had really happened, contacted the authorities, and Justin Volpe was arrested alongside some fellow officers. When the image
I was wondering, like, they contacted authorities and then the officers just showed back up. He's like, what do you want? This is what's insane, because there would be cases of this where the officer just gets away with it. They just walk, the officer... I was watching a show called Blue Bloods. It's a very good cop show. Love the cop show. There's one thing about it, because there's this one officer whose whole thing is you protect officers no matter what they do. No matter what they do, you seemingly protect officers. And it's so fucking insane.
Images of Abner's face with the visible damage were seen by the public, and the graphic details of his truly horrific internal injuries came out. There was understandable outrage. He had to receive medical treatment for 2 months at a hospital and endure multiple surgeries to repair damage to his bladder and colon. There were demonstrations in the streets, protesting not only this egregious example of police brutality.
Hold on, what's the point of this? Hold on. Oh, man. What's the point of a woman who's got a toilet head? Like, I understand you're trying to cause... What is this gonna prove? What is this meant to be? This is a choice. I'm just saying, that's a choice.
Demonstrations in the streets, protesting not only this egregious example of police brutality, but the many other non-reported instances. Justin faced trial towards the end of 1999 and eventually pleaded guilty to some of the charges, receiving a sentence of 30 years. He had to pay a small fine and a much larger restitution charge to the victim, upwards of $250,000 at the time, for the pain, suffering, and indignity that he had suffered that night. Abner was eventually awarded a payout of $8,750,000 from the city of New York. Justin Volpe is a free man today, having served 24 years in prison.
I hate that. Why'd you tell me that? I don't want to know this fucking prick is out there. Oh, I don't want to know that. That'll make me want to go hunting. I'm not going to. But there's a part of me that would. Fucking beat him with the broomstick, you fucking psychopath.
One of his fellow officers received a 15-year sentence for his part in the beating and for lying about it, and was released in 2007 after serving just over half of his sentence. 3 other officers were initially convicted for helping to cover up what had happened, but their sentences were overturned. For his part, Abner Louima used the settlement money to do good in his own community and beyond. He paid for the education of some children from low-income families in the area where he grew up, and had plans to fund a hospital and a community center in Haiti, where he's originally from.
Dude gets a payout and still puts good in the community, feeling he probably needs to because police don't, in his mind. After what that, I mean, this guy never trusts a police officer again. This guy can never trust. This guy could be robbed. I guarantee he will not call police. This guy wants nothing to do with police officers after this. I guarantee you it. But he paid for the education of children in the low-income area where he started a center thing when in the area he grew up. This man is just the most generous person.
This is the only instance of outright police brutality on this list, as I felt like the rest of the examples on here were far more extreme. However, because of just how violent and depraved Justin Volpe was to Abner Louima, I felt that he simply had to be included on this list, as what he did that night can only be described as pure evil. While a lot of the crimes on this list are mainly violent in their execution, i.e. killings and vicious assaults, there is a second type of crime that is equally as reviled in society as cold-blooded murder, and that is the crime of rape. Forcing yourself sexually on someone against their will is treated with the disgust and hatred that it well should be. As an aside, due to the censorship of certain words related to these types of crimes, I'll have to use less direct phrases to talk about them in this segment. However, this does not in any way diminish the very real severity of these actions, and is not meant to downplay them. Daniel Holtzclaw was born on the 10th of December 1986 in Guam. After graduating high school, where he excelled in sports, he went on to university, where he similarly showed his athletic prowess. He achieved his degree in criminal justice, and after failing to get drafted for the NFL, he would follow in the footsteps of his father and join the police. He began to serve as a police officer.
You know what I don't understand about this thing, right? Like, this guy is raping, I'm gonna assume women, and I could be wrong. At this moment. He hasn't told us, so I'm just gonna assume women. But like, do you know how easy it is to pick up someone when you're an officer? Do you know the physical shape usually most officers are in? It's easier to get someone. I don't understand why the heck most officers do. Do you know how easy it is for people to go after police officers? They like, most people like people in power because they think they'll get away with shit, or because they got money and shit. Like,
in Oklahoma City, where he would generally work the 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift in one of the more deprived neighborhoods in the city. In June 2014, after he had finished his shift, he would pull over a 57-year-old woman named Janine Liggins, but would not radio it in to dispatch. He would make her expose herself to him before forcing her to perform an indecent act on him, despite her pleas to stop. Following the incident, she went and filed a report. Later that same day, when he went to
58-year-old too. He didn't even do it to like a young woman. He did it to like a very older woman. But man, you're even, what's even weird? You're good, like, you're a good-looking individual. You would easily pick up someone. What the fuck's wrong with you? You would easily get a chick.
Clocked back in, he was taken and interrogated regarding the report and was suspended. They took DNA swabs and removed him from active duty while they investigated the claims. What followed was a litany of other accusations that came out, detailing a disturbing and repeated abuse of power. By the time the investigations had concluded, there were no less than 36 individual accusations. There were a total of 13 victims that came forward to tell of their encounters with Daniel, and with the exception of Janine Liggins, it seemed most
Did it seem like was this a case of office, like it being revealed that this officer had been, is being investigated, and that sparked the, all of them to start coming out, telling more and more stories? Or, because I'm just curious what started the rest of the women, doing, like, coming out and telling their stories.
of them had either outstanding warrants or were involved with drugs or sex work. The picture that was painted was of Daniel accosting these women when they were alone, knowing that they had established issues already with the law and using his position to force them into various acts. The officers collecting these reports compared the location data recorded on his patrol car with the testimonies and in most cases felt confident that they matched up. Daniel was arrested and charged in August 2014 and officially fired at the start of 2015 before his trial began in November of that.
I fucking hope he was fired before his trial. You imagine the reaction of them, like, okay, I guess we're gonna fire him since he was proven guilty. Oh, fucked up your office, police fucking thing would have looked. Makes you all look fucking bad.
That same year, he stood accused of multiple forms of sexual assault and counts of rape by different women. On December 10th, he was found guilty on 18 charges and
sentenced to 263 years. Oh boy, you ain't never getting out. I've seen the clip of him reacting this. I've seen this clip of him reacting in prison. I didn't know the story and him being sentenced to 263 years. Whew. You ain't never getting out, nor should you.
given a sentence of 263 years in prison. While this heavy sentence might seem like the story of a bad cop being taken off the streets and put behind bars where he belongs, there are some points that need to be addressed. There are, in some circles on the internet at least, questions being raised about whether he committed these heinous crimes that he was convicted of at all. How can this even be a possibility when he had the testimony of 13 separate women against him, testimonies that were believed in a court of law and supporting evidence alongside them? Some have pointed to some failings in the process that the arresting officers took. They point to no physical evidence of a crime taking place, discrepancies between the position of his police vehicle as reported by its automated systems, and the locations and timings of some of the accusations and methodology.
I think in this case, these are people who are desperate to make officers look good. I don't think this is a case, because there's no way 13 people's cases are all wrong. And he did none of them. And somehow the evidence and all that is all wrong and everyone's wrong except this officer who's the innocent bystander. There is no fucking way, okay? If this was 1 or 2, possibly, 13 would not get this wrong. Stop protecting bad officers. Stop doing it. Stop to look. There are going to be bad officers out there. You don't need to protect every fucking officer. So he fucking did it.
Used by investigating officers. It's alleged that they sought out a specific demographic of women that he had been involved in his normal police duties, informed them that he was being investigated for potential sexual offences, and then asked if they had any information regarding similar events. However, his conviction was upheld when he appealed it, and whether those campaigning for his
good, because they probably told the story and they looked at them like, I was like, is this guy actually gonna try this shit? You expected any jury to believe that 13 cases are wrong and he's an innocent guy? Like, come on. And this is another thing, right? The evidence is not that he arrested them at one point. That's not the evidence. There's gotta be more shit that would prove he actually sexually assaulted them. Enough for a jury to find him guilty.
Release of misinformed or blind to what he did remains a moot point when he has been found guilty under the law. As it stands right now, Daniel Holtzclaw is serving life in prison for using his position to force women into taking part in his
I'm glad he's spending life in prison. The fucking asshole deserves it.
sick and twisted fantasies, and he's now paying the price by being locked up where he belongs.
Good. Deserves it.
Sometimes a job can bring out the best in people. It can highlight the strengths in who they are and really give them a purpose. Other times, especially in a job where someone is given even the slightest bit of authority, it can have the opposite effect and bring out the worst of them. Very occasionally, it can draw out darkness in individuals that is far worse than any that knew them would ever think. Craig Allen Payer was born on March 16, 1950. After a seemingly normal childhood and graduating high school, he found himself drawn towards a career in law enforcement. He would join the California Highway Patrol in 1973 in his early 20s after completing all necessary training, and he would find success in his chosen job, being considered a solid, if not exemplary officer. It was December 27, 1986, when Cara Knott encountered Craig Payer. She was traveling on the interstate, heading back home after meeting her boyfriend when he signaled her to pull over, not on the shoulder, but on an off-ramp that was away from the freeway and fairly isolated. From other reports that emerged after the fact, it seemed like Payer was regularly abusing both his position and this specific off-ramp in order to make unwanted sexual advances towards predominantly young, lone females. Based on this, it's believed that there was an altercation between him and Cara, presumed to be down to either her rejecting his proposals or him attempting to initiate unwanted physical contact that resulted in him killing her. Using his police-issued flashlight,
It is insane how officers do. Again, it's insane to me now. In this case, this guy's old as fuck, right? He's like 30, 40 years old. So he ain't getting nobody, right? He ain't gonna get nobody at this age. If he don't have anyone, he ain't probably gonna get no one. Hard this day and age for 40, 50-year-olds to find relationships and start finding them. So if he ain't already married and shit, he ain't gonna find someone. So he, for some reason, his sick mind felt that was the only way to get shit. And then someone said no to him and his feelings got so fucking hurt he killed them. Like, that the fuck?
he beats her on the head after she started fighting back. When she was subdued, he used a rope to strangle her to death. After she was dead, he disposed of the body by dropping it off a nearby bridge, where it was discovered shortly after. In a strange coincidence, there was a short section featured on the local television not long after, where the reporter drove with Craig. After this aired, reports began to flood in from other women who had been on the receiving end of his unwanted romantic advances.
Right! I forgot about this. We saw something about this. We saw this in a video. I forget what video it was, but we saw a video with this fucking commercial on it. And the reveal that this guy was the killer. I fucking thought, I remember this now. Because I called it by the guy, because the officer looked sketchy as fuck. He looked sketchy.
And specifically at the location where Cara Knott had lost her life. Craig, who was a 13-year veteran of the force at the time, had initially avoided all suspicion, but would soon draw attention to himself. The first indication that something was amiss was when he returned to his home on the night of the crime with his face scratched up. While his wife never thought much of it, when the truth eventually came out, it would be clear that these were the lasting signs of Cara's last desperate attempts to
Man's got a wife and still couldn't do it. Evil.
defend herself. The way in which she was killed and the manner in which her body was dumped had initially led investigating officers away from the possibility that the crime had been committed by someone with experience in law enforcement. However, Craig would...
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I wouldn't think an officer that... The way she was killed wouldn't be the one thing. It would be the toss off the bridge. I would think an officer would be a bit smarter than that. I would think an officer would be, especially a 13 year, I think is what he said, well over a decade on the job, would know where, like, places they could hide a body that's not off a bridge.
would soon start badgering the officers looking into the case with a combination of questions and statements that not only showed a little too much interest, but also made them very suspicious of his intentions. Later, one of the team would describe it as almost the verbal equivalent of returning to the scene of the crime, while it is known that criminals will often revisit the location of heinous acts after the fact in order to, quote, relive it. Craig seemed to be doing whatever he could to discuss the crime with those in the know, either trying to experience it again or sounding them out as to whether they suspected him or not. As well as other incriminating behavior, evidence began to mount against him. A fabric strand found on the body was tied back directly to him, and a witness came forward to tell officers that they had witnessed Craig pulling Kara's vehicle over, and specifically directing her to this secluded spot that he seemed so fond of. As other women spoke of their uncomfortable encounters with him, it began to emerge that he would waylay these lone females for lengths of time, sometimes up to 2 hours. By comparison, when he was pulling over men or couples, the encounters would last less than 10 minutes. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Kara Knox.
How the fuck, right? Even if if you don't do anything sexually to them, what the fuck are you doing to make a regular traffic stop go 2 hours? How badly are you trying to flirt with these people?
And went to trial. Although the jury were unable to reach a verdict at the first time of asking, he was convicted of the murder at the second trial on August 4th, 1988, and sentenced to 25 years to life. Craig was denied parole the first time of asking. His subsequent attempts in both 2008 and 2012 were also denied, and he was kept behind bars. A factor that played into his denial was the fact that the board felt that he showed no remorse for the crime. In fact, he claimed, and has continued to claim, his innocence with regards to the whole affair. And while the technology regarding the use of DNA samples to make matches or exonerate or convict criminals was nowhere near the level it is in our modern world, at the time of the crime, there were samples safe in the crime scene that could be compared now. He has consistently refused to provide a sample of his DNA for comparison to the ones held in evidence. While he has never given a specific reason for this,
can't you just force him? I guess he's already in jail, right? Although my weird mind would go, so you did it then? He'd be like, no, I didn't do it, but you had to have. Because any normal human being would want to give DNA to show they didn't do it. You clearly did it, that's why you don't want to give DNA. Simple.
we are left to assume that any man that was certain this evidence would prove categorically that he had been wrongly convicted would be providing any and all cooperation.
Agreed.
His refusal certainly does little to make it seem like he is the victim of a miscarriage of justice, and this also factored into the parole board's decision to deny his freedom. By the time of his 2012 rejection, he had already served a quarter of a century behind bars. The next opportunity for him to apply for parole will not be for another 3 years from the time of writing, in the year 2027, where he will be a man in his late 70s. It's safe to assume that by then, he will still have refused to supply any kind of DNA sample, thus still more or less proving that he was indeed the one who killed Kara, and as such, it's fairly likely that he will spend the remainder of his life behind bars.
As he should. I'm assuming all of these people are either going to be sentenced to death or sentenced to life in prison, and all of them should be in prison. I still can't believe the one who was, they told me was released. I hated hearing that.
Have you ever heard the phrase, 2 is company but 3 is a crowd? It can be applied in all sorts of situations, but when it comes to matters of the heart, a love triangle can spell all sorts of tragedy and disaster. We need look no further than Sherry Rasmussen, Stephanie Lazarus, and John Ruetten to
I know all about this one. I'll let Savax talk about this one.
see how true and how tragic this can be. Stephanie Lazarus was born on May 4th in the year 1960. While she was studying, she met John Ruetten, and the two became romantically involved. While they went on a number of dates together, John would claim that there was never any serious or long-term plans between them. This, however, was not how Stephanie viewed the relationship. She clearly believed that the two of them were more serious and that there was a future to it. As such, when she heard that John had become romantically involved with someone else, she was heartbroken. Later, John would admit that the pair did have sex at least one additional time after their relationship broke down, in an effort to, quote, give her closure, but it was clear his intentions were pointed elsewhere.
Who the fuck? What logic is that? That's not... Don't do that, ever. ever, I'm not even joking, do not do that with someone. If you're dating someone else and a person you were talking to but didn't go nowhere with, watch it. Do not have sex with them to have closure. That's fucking weird.
John had met another woman named Sherry Rasmussen. Sherry worked at a local hospital as head of nursing and had always been academically gifted. Her sister, Connie, recounted that she started to attend university at the age of just 16. She had already advanced within her career, and her love life was looking promising as well, as she tied the knot with John and they got married in 1985. Despite this, Stephanie still found reasons to be around John. On one occasion, she visited the couple's home under the pretense of having John wax her skis for her. She returned a second time to collect them, and Sherry stated that she was uncomfortable with her coming around. She felt it was clear that Stephanie had feelings for him and was using any excuse to approach him, married or not.
It's understandable, right? If you have feelings for someone and you can't let them go despite them moving on. Been there. You don't find your way around. And if you're the guy, in this case, you don't keep her around. Or if it was me, you don't keep me around.
By this point, Stephanie had completed her training at the police academy and was serving in the Los Angeles Police Department. She made it clear in conversation and writing to her parents, her roommate, and clearly anyone that would listen, that she was meant to be with John. She even took to following Sherry.
What was it? I thought I wouldn't pause as much, but I'm learning more about this than I did with any other time I've heard about this. Because usually it's just a short time frame they talk about this. Usually it's just the interrogation video that with the officer talking to her is what we see. That's why I like Savok. He gives me information before we talk about the main thing. I don't even know if he's going to bring up that video. I feel like he has to, right? But he may not show it. But this is... What was it about John? What is it that makes him... Since they've only went on a few dates and they had sex about probably a few times, what is it that makes him so... like that he's the one? You know what I mean?
With the final escalation being when she approached her at her place of work and said, "If I can't have John, no one else will." Around 3 months after John and Sherry were married, he would return home to find the car missing, the garage doors wide open, and broken glass indicating that someone had broken in. He entered the home and found his wife dead on the floor with a number of gunshot wounds. The police were called, and after some investigation...
I have to ask this, because I remember this case enough. It took them so long to catch, I think Stephanie is her name, right? Catch her. I would immediately have gone to her. I don't even know how it took so long to catch her.
They decided that she had been killed in a robbery. Aside from the car, the only thing that appeared to be missing from the home was the couple's marriage license. They believed that Sherry, judging by the fact that she was lightly dressed, had surprised a person or people breaking into her home and had been shot in the ensuing struggle. Investigating officers did follow other lines of inquiry, but quickly ruled out John as a suspect. Not only were his movements and his alibi airtight, but he was also clearly distraught, opting to move away from the city shortly after. Sherry's parents would claim that they mentioned Stephanie's worrying behavior to investigating officers.
I don't know. I would have drawn her immediately. They're like, oh, there was the woman who was stalking, obsessed with you too, and obsessed with you and that. Oh, I'll be looking at her. She'd be like, yeah, but she's not. I don't give a shit. She's clearly crazy. There's a craziness side to her, and that's all I need.
But nothing more came of it, since there had been other similar...
Probably because of... Hold on, wait.
Although non-fatal burglaries in the area, law enforcement...
Oh, that's interesting. So because of the fact, uncoincidentally, I don't think Stephanie planned this part. Maybe actually Stephanie might have. She might have been leading them this way. I don't actually know what her position was on the force. But the fact that there were other robberies near the area, they weren't fatal because there were other robberies, and police, because the car was missing, and pretty much only for that reason, they were going under the assumption it's a robbery, decided that, oh, they must be connected, and ignored Stephanie. Despite the fact all the signs are there.
And seemed to go down the route of this being just another home invasion gone wrong, and lacking any other leads or evidence, the case went cold. Sherry's parents kept pushing the local police department to look at other possibilities, but were rebuffed constantly. In the intervening years,
where was someone like me? I'll be the only one out there listening. They'd be like, look, it's Dawn. Huh? I'm like, okay. You have a guest? And they'd say Stephanie. And I'm like, she was obsessed with John. She had a thing. I'm like, okay, I'll look into it. Like, that's the worst you can do, right? Is just say you look into it. And if there's nothing there, then nothing there. If there's something there, she gets caught.
Stephanie reached out to John, and they very briefly resumed their romance. The new lead detective in the cold case reported that John had contacted him directly around this time to ensure there was no indication that Stephanie was in any way involved in the murder. A clear indication, if nothing else, that John had considered the possibility, even if the police seemed reluctant to. More time passed, and Stephanie would progress within her career, get married to a fellow officer, and have a child. John too would go on to remarry, and it wouldn't be until 2009, during an LAPD push to clear cold cases, that any more progress would be made. Around 5 years earlier, the DNA from a bite mark on Sherry had been analysed using newly available technology, and while it didn't match anyone within the database, it was proven to be female. The person looking into it asked the question if there had been any investigation into this unidentified female, and was rebuffed. But during this new push, a pair of detectives began to review the case with all the evidence and approached it as a possible murder rather than the burglary it had long been thought to be. They had Stephanie as one of the 5 suspects, and slowly whittled it down until it was just her and one other woman. When the final other woman was eliminated, it left them with the real possibility that a fellow officer with nearly 25 years of service could be the killer. There is footage available online of the moment that her colleagues confronted her about being a suspect in the killing, so many years after the fact. Initially, they framed it as an informal meeting where they were wanting to use her vast experience to help them with a case before beginning to ask her about her relationship with Sherry, and specifically if she knew John. You can clearly see her slowly beginning to put together that they are onto her, and she begins to clam up after admitting that there was a connection. She tells the recording officer that she isn't happy with the way they have gone about confronting her, and then, correctly, wonders out loud if she should speak to a lawyer. What Stephanie wasn't to know was that in addition to the obviously fatal gunshot wounds and the damage from being struck over the head, investigators had managed to obtain a DNA sample from the bite wound at the time. When their suspicions began to point them in the direction of Stephanie, the investigation team got a sample of her DNA to compare from a drinking straw that they sneakily took. When the profiles were a match, they now had evidence enough to confront her.
Wow, Jesus! I didn't know what the photos get. They showed this photo. She looks crazy. Look, tell me she don't look crazy, okay? Tell me she don't look crazy. I don't like that. I've said about 2 or 3 videos today that there's a crazy woman. But tell me she don't look like she had crazy ass. She looks damn crazy. You can't tell me otherwise.
On March 8, 2012, she was found guilty of the murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 27 years. She had pled not guilty. She had the possibility of parole after only 11 years, and although this was rejected, the fact that she was even eligible after such a relatively short sentence being served caused widespread outrage, not only amongst Sherry's family and friends, but beyond. All other appeals have failed, and Stephanie Lazarus remains in jail at the age of 62. To this day, she has never admitted that she killed Sherry, despite all the evidence to the contrary. She spent over a quarter of a century serving as a police officer, no doubt
Okay, yeah, she's definitely crazy. She's 100% crazy.
gaining the respect of all of her colleagues, but little did they know that they were working with a murderer who took the life of an innocent woman because she just couldn't accept that John didn't love her anymore. It really is a shame that it took so long for her to finally be put behind bars where she belongs, and even worse, that she'll be getting out one day.
Yeah, she might get out one day. That is an insane thought.
There is a certain level of trust that people put in the police, and for most of the general public, they will tend to listen to what they are told by someone who is apparently enforcing the law. Sadly, some have been known to abuse this power, and one of the worst examples happened in the UK in 2021. Wayne Couzens was born on the 20th of December 1972 in Dover, England. He worked for more than 2 decades alongside his father in a garage before moving into law enforcement in 2011. a career his brother was already in. He first worked with the Civil Nuclear Constabulary for 7 years before transferring to the Metropolitan Police in 2018. It was here that he progressed to serve in the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, where he was trained to use a firearm and helped to guard high-profile targets and embassies. By the year 2021, he had been in this position for 3 years. Outside of police work, he had been married to his wife Alina for 16 years, and the couple had 2 children. On the 3rd of March 2021, he would cross paths with Sarah Everard. Sarah was a 33-year-old from Surrey who was working as a marketing executive. She had been visiting a friend and left to begin the war back home, but disappeared. After the alarm was raised, police began to search and investigate. It would transpire that Wayne had approached Sarah as she walked, pulling his car up alongside her, using his warrant card, proof of being an officer, and other police equipment to convince her that he was indeed a member of law enforcement. He began to question her as to what she was up to. Since there were restrictions due to the pandemic in the UK at the time, he falsely told her that she was breaking the law and that he would place her under arrest. Believing that the charge was legitimate, Sarah was handcuffed and placed into the back of Wayne's vehicle. He drove her 2 hours away before transferring her to his own personal vehicle. From there, he drove on further, where he sexually assaulted and killed Sarah, strangling her with his belt. He disposed of the
Pure evil. You can't tell me what that is, just straight evilness. There was nothing about that that is not pre-planned. He planned from the moment he saw her walking alone to make her believe she was arrested, sexually assault, and kill her. Evil.
the body in large bags that he had hidden in a plot of land that he owned. She was reported missing by her boyfriend, and her steps were retraced using CCTV, identifying Wayne as picking her up and the hire car that he had used. This initial investigation would lead to Wayne being arrested at his home 3 days after the crime took place, initially on suspicion of kidnapping. On the 10th of March, her remains would be discovered, and the charge of murder was added, with evidence showing him putting her in the car and her body recovered. It was clear that he had committed the crime. What followed was not only a criminal trial, but an investigation into how someone like Wayne had managed a relatively successful career in the police without being reported. Wayne Couzens would plead guilty to kidnapping and raping Sarah Everard in June of 2021, and the next month also plead guilty to her murder. When it came to sentencing, his abuse of his position and the way he used it to manipulate his victim were taken into consideration, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a whole life order, a sentence that means he will never be freed under UK law, no matter what.
Good. Let him rot. Let him rot in prison. That's where he belongs.
The judge stated that the severity of the sentence reflected the disgust that the legal system, fellow officers and the public felt for the heinous crime that he had committed. The leader of the Labour Party in the UK, Sir Keir Starmer, who himself was in the legal profession before turning to politics, asked the following question on a radio show, one that summed up the question on the lips of everyone else in the country. How did he slip through the net? There were obviously warning signs of what he did to get through the net. I know that thousands upon thousands of police officers doing a fantastic job up and down the country are absolutely sickened by this, but how on earth did he get through the net is the critical question that now just has to be answered. The more the inquiry looked into Wayne's previous conduct and the way he was viewed by his fellow officers, the more burning the question became. At his posting before the Metropolitan Police, he gained the horrendous nickname of the Rapist for his general conduct. In addition, other worrying behaviours came to light. He would be charged and convicted of exposing himself to a female pedestrian on the street in an incident prior to the murder. Some of the WhatsApp messages.
Oh yeah. That just screams noble officer. That's the guy you want chasing the thing. That's the guy you want protecting the city. A fucking guy that exposes himself to random people. Great. Love that.
Messages that Wayne and his fellow officers had exchanged became public and were so grossly offensive that they led to the jailing of 2 of his colleagues. They were described as being, quote, homophobic, misogynistic and racist, and did little to dispel the notion that the police force had a problem with unsavory characters deeply integrated within it. A series of vigils were held protesting not only this case, but the general lack of safety that a lot of women in the country felt and feel to this day, and the fact that many of them felt that the police force were not there to protect them or make them feel any safer. The Metropolitan Police committed to a number of measures in the aftermath of the conviction and the inquiries, which included an action plan for tackling violence against women, specialist predatory offenders units, and a, quote, urgent review of all current investigations. Despite assurances from those in positions of authority, many remain unconvinced. Wayne Couzens is
Here's what I think. I will stick with this, and I will always stick with this. I will never change my opinion on it. When it comes to investigating police, it has to be done by people who aren't police. I will always stick to the sentiment. It will never change. It should never be officers and police departments investigating officers, because they will try to protect each other. Especially if it's multiple, they'll definitely try to protect them. You can't. It has to be people outside of the police station, in my opinion. I will always stick with that.
currently imprisoned at HMP Franklin in Durham, where he is likely to stay for the remainder of his life.
Good.
Sometimes people aren't quite
Just because I'm curious, hold on. I'm going to take... Just, how far we go? 45 minutes only. And we're not even halfway. Oh boy.
what they seem. Just because someone appears good or honest or trustworthy, it doesn't mean that they are truly that way deep down. That isn't to say that you should not trust people, more that sometimes that off feeling that you get about someone can prove to be more true than you'd ever know.
That is why I always stick with the sentiment. If you have a gut feeling, something bad's gonna happen or you shouldn't trust someone, do not ignore it. Ever. Ever. No matter what situation, do not ignore it. Because your gut knows. Your head knows when something dangerous is gonna happen. Your head and gut will tell you. Your conscious, your subconscious, everything will warn you that there is something wrong with someone. It will do it when it comes to relationships. It'll do it when it comes to just introduce yourself to someone. It will do it to anyone. And if your gut just says, if you force yourself to ignore it, something bad happens. In my mind, you should have known, because your body warns you.
And other times, people are exactly how they seem to be. Take the case of Gerard John Schaefer Jr. He was born in Neenah, Wisconsin on March 26, 1946. With two younger siblings, he struggled in his youth with feelings that they were favored over him, as well as issues with his father specifically, who was a heavy drinker, shouted often, and used his career as a traveling salesman to be generally absent from the family home. He didn't seem to have a good relationship with his mother either. The family moved around a fair amount due to their father's occupation, and a generally unhappy relationship between the parents eventually broke down and resulted in divorce. This seemed to do little to stabilize the already erratic Gerard. While he had some typical and healthy hobbies, such as yachting, hunting, and fishing, he was also developing strange ones like stealing underwear that belonged to local women and getting sexually aroused from tying himself up. This would be the first time that many of his lifelong sexual quirks would appear. He had a girlfriend in his teens who would later state that he enjoyed rape play fantasies where they would have consensually simulated non-consensual intercourse. Gerard also began to cross-dress, but he would later claim that this was to dodge the draft for the ongoing Vietnam War rather than for sexual pleasure. His darker fantasies would become
Sure, that's why you did it.
a major part of his life and something that he thought about on a daily basis.
Look, I'm not even saying there's anything wrong with cross-dressing. People do that, that's fine. I'm not, against it. That's just not the reason why he did it. He did not cross-dress at that point. I don't believe for a second that he crosses just to avoid the Vietnam War. I don't buy for a second that was the reason he did it.
When it came to begin a career, Gerard got a degree in business and then pursued his teacher's license. With certification in hand, he began teaching at a local high school, but didn't last long as he was fired for inappropriate behavior. These issues with authority, combined with his apparent arrogance, meant that the pattern repeated at the next two schools he worked for. It soon became apparent, even to him, that teaching was not his career path best suited to him. He also briefly attempted to become a priest, but was not accepted. He worked as a security guard for a while, before deciding to become a police officer. And
there is nothing about this guy that tells me he should be a police officer. I don't know any place. They probably just take anyone as an officer at this point.
And despite the fact that he didn't meet the necessary standards when it came to psychological testing, and lied about his job history on his application, he was hired and began
like I said, I think they just take anyone. They're like, yeah, Yeah, you look like you could probably run a good amount of miles and you can drive a vehicle. Yeah, you're an officer. Go ahead. Go get. Yeah, you might be crazy. I don't care. Just go be an officer.
Serving as an officer in the Broward County Police Department towards the end of 1971. At this point, he was still only in his mid-20s, and as well as a rather checkered employment history, he already had a failed marriage behind him. Gerard had gotten married in 1968, but divorced after only 2 years when his wife complained about his constant sexual requests and all the time he spent away hunting. He would meet his second wife just before he started his career in law enforcement, getting married in 1971. But it wouldn't be long before his seeming inability to behave correctly within the confines of a job struck again. He lost his first police job when he started harassing some of the women he pulled over, trying to become romantically involved with them by using the information he gathered from the traffic stops. This wouldn't stop him from transferring to Martin County, where he would end up becoming deputy sheriff with the help of a fake letter of recommendation that he forged from his previous county. But, you guessed it, Gerard would soon exhibit behavior that was completely unhinged, and it's clear that there was a definite escalation in what he was doing. A little over a month into his new job, he came across 2 female hitchhikers named Paula Sue Wells and Nancy Trotter, and convinced them that hitchhiking was illegal in the county, which it absolutely wasn't. He gave them a ride home.
Oh my, hitchhiking's illegal in any country. Is there anywhere in the world where hitchhiking is illegal? I mean that literally. I actually don't know. Is there anywhere in the world where hitchhiking is illegal?
And arranged to go to the beach with them the next day, except when he picked them up the next morning, he drove away from their intended destination and instead headed into a secluded area. Here, he pulled a gun on them and tied the pair to a tree, mimicking his strange obsession from his adolescence. Once he had them securely restrained, a call came through on his radio, and he was forced to leave the pair where they were and go to the police station. While he was gone, they managed to escape. Gerard returned to the tree to find them gone, and realizing that it was pretty much guaranteed that they would report him, phoned his boss and told him, quote, "I've done something foolish. You're going to be mad at me." He claimed that he had intended to tie them up and scare them as a deterrent from hitchhiking, but that he had overdone it. The sheriff and other deputies managed to locate one girl, and the second was picked up by a trucker and taken to the station. They gave a full account of what had happened and the description of Gerard to the men there. The sheriff, to his credit, was a little more than, quote, mad. Not only did he fire Gerard, he also arrested him with charges of aggravated assault.
How did he think the sheriff wouldn't be mad at him? Like, what do you think the sheriff was gonna do? He's like, yeah, well, you know, something's happened, you did it the wrong way, you know, go get him next time. No, I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with you? You sick freak, what the hell is wrong with you?
And false imprisonment. Gerard had his trial set for November the same year, and was released after he posted the money required to make bail. It wouldn't take long for a second and more deadly plan to form in his mind and be carried out. After a few weeks of freedom, he abducted 2 girls aged 17 and 16, named Susan and Georgia, and went through the same procedure as he had the first time. Initially befriending them, he promised to take them for a drive to the beach, all the while using the false name Jerry Shepherd. One of their mothers had even met Jerry prior to the fateful journey and seemed wary of him, enough to take down the license plate of the vehicle. After the 3 set out on their journey, Gerard would once again take a diversion from the expected route. He tied them to trees in a remote area, but this time he did what he had promised to do to the others before he was called away, and killed them. He dismembered their bodies and stripped them of their clothes. After he was finished, he buried their remains. Their bodies would not be discovered until Gerard had stood trial for the first abduction and been sent to prison. However, when the police began to look into the way Susan and Georgia were murdered, it didn't take long for them to see similarities to the way that the former deputy had abducted the 2 women earlier. With this evidence, they obtained a search warrant for the house where Gerard had been staying, and they found a treasure trove of horrifying things. His twisted writings, where he discussed murder and acts of violence, albeit through the lens of fiction, and an arsenal of multiple guns and knives. What was more worrying were the seemingly random assortment of personal belongings that all seemed to link back to various cases where women had disappeared in the region over the past few years. Items that range from identifying documents like passports and driver's licenses, all the way to human teeth and scraps of clothing. When it was all...
Oh my gosh, this guy has done way more than just one. This isn't like he failed once and succeeded the second time. This was the times he had succeeded is way more than we thought.
All collected, sorted and investigated, law enforcement believed that there were potential connections to upwards of 30 disappearances, all of them women. When he was confronted with the evidence, he attempted to hand-wave it all away. He claimed that he had either found these things or been given them at some point. In the end, he was prosecuted only for the murders of Susan and Georgia, since there was almost no airtight case. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 terms of life in prison. All of his subsequent appeals were rejected, and he maintained his innocence even in the face of overwhelming evidence. He passed his time in prison writing fiction that seemed to mirror some of his other suspected crimes closely, informing on other inmates and filing lawsuits against writers who called him, quote, a serial killer. Gerard John Schaefer would meet
My man, I think you're a serial killer. I dare you to sue me. I would love for you to sue me. You are 100% a serial killer.
his end in December 1995 when he was stabbed to death in his cell by another inmate named Vincent Riviera. He had suffered multiple stab wounds, had his throat slashed and several bones broken. The man, known by various aliases such as JG, Jerry Shepard, the Killer Cop and the Butcher of Blind Creek, lost his life in an attack as vicious as the
Fucking A. Never mind, he ain't gonna be suing me. His ass is in the court. His ass is in the dirt. Another prisoner said fuck you and he just fucking took him out. Stabbed him as brutal as he killed the others. Fucking A.
ones he had carried out himself. How much of his writings were truly fictional, and how much was taunting authorities by describing other attacks and murders they suspected him of, would remain unknown. Cyrus Trowbridge, the judge that passed down his sentence, made the following comment on hearing the news. He's finally gotten the death sentence he ultimately deserved, but couldn't be given.
Fucking A. Antoinette Frank, okay?
History is full of examples of the crazy things that people will do for love, and the lengths that some people will go to in order to back up someone that they truly feel strongly for. And sometimes, a gun and a badge are no object to the limits some will push to. Antoinette Renee Frank was born on the 30th of April in 1971 in Louisiana. She was living in New Orleans when she first applied to join the police force there. Now at this point in the early 90s, it was a police force that was struggling in a lot of different ways. With staffing levels low and a seemingly constant struggle to keep their numbers up, it certainly seemed like they were desperate to take on anyone that they could. They had issues within the department regarding officers being caught engaging in criminal activity.
I love it. So they just kept finding new people. They just kept take anyone. They don't even care if you completely get. You can fail every part, but they're like, yeah, you fucking do. Screw it. We need someone.
And were further hamstrung by low salaries and a policy that barred non-residents of New Orleans from serving on the force. On her initial application, there were a number of minor issues noted, such as the fact that she lied several times on it and failed elements of the standard psychiatric tests. Despite this, she applied a second time and was accepted. She passed the training portion of the academy and then moved to active duty, where she had mixed reports. Antoinette was sometimes performing at a high enough level to receive awards and accolades from her department, but at other times was considered a candidate for further remedial training. Overall, her colleagues had no major issues with her, but not many of them were close with her either. About a year into her career in law enforcement, Antoinette would meet Rogers Lacaze, a local drug dealer and criminal. He had managed to get himself shot, and she was the responding officer. Despite the fact that it was unethical, probably not a good idea in any sense, and could well see her get in trouble with the superiors at her place of work, they began a romantic relationship. But it wouldn't be long before Antoinette found herself living on both sides of the law. Whether it was the influence of her newfound love or not, reports started to be made that painted her in a less than professional light. Whether it was her boyfriend being seen inside of her patrol car as the pair drove around the local streets, or some police interventions on her part that looked a little biased to outside viewers. Take an incident that occurred in early 1995. Two men had a disagreement with Rogers at a party, but it didn't escalate any further than that. They left the location and got in their car to drive away, but were pulled over shortly after a short distance by Antoinette in her squad car. They complied with her orders to get out of the vehicle, but noticed Rogers with her, and also that he was armed. Sensing a trap, a scuffle ensued, and a gun went off. A member of the public and a passing sheriff helped break it up, and Antoinette insisted that Rogers was an innocent party, causing the other men to be arrested and charged. As all of this was starting to slowly unravel at the seams, the second flaw with the recruitment process in the New Orleans Police Department was becoming obvious. As well as the manning issues leading to them take on people that were seemingly not suitable for the job, the relatively low pay meant that many officers would work second jobs. In fact, there was a Vietnamese restaurant in the east of the city, owned by the Vu family, where Antoinette herself had worked as a security guard. and it must have been a fairly good gig for off-duty officers, as one of her colleagues, Ronald A. Williams, was currently working there. After all, it seemed like a fairly steady and low-pressure job for a little extra cash. He was 25 years old at the time, with a wife and 2 young children, and had served for 4 years with the police force. This would all change on March the 4th, 1995. Despite the night going as any other, by the time the sun rose the next day, Officer Williams would be dead, as well as multiple members of the Vu family, and Antoinette Frank would be in custody, earning the dubious record of being the only serving New Orleans officer to be charged with the murder of a colleague. Antoinette and Rogers entered the restaurant and began to threaten the staff, looking for cash that was usually left in the kitchen. Unbeknownst to them, it had been moved to a different location within the restaurant. Despite the protests and pleading from the staff, Rogers opened fire, killing off-duty Ronald with multiple gunshot wounds. 2 of the family's children that were working at the time were assaulted and then shot, even after the pair of robbers had found the money. They left the restaurant, knowing that other members of the staff and the family had seen them enter, and possibly even witnessed the murders. Antoinette led Rogers out to the car, and then circled back to the scene of the crime, hoping to blend in with the attending officers and silence any potential witnesses. However, there were multiple officers on scene by the time she had arrived, and one of the surviving family members immediately pointed her out and she was arrested. Facing charges of 3 counts of first-degree murder, Antoinette and Rogers were both taken into custody and due to be tried later in 1995. Rogers was first up in July and was found guilty on all counts, receiving the death penalty. Antoinette followed on September 5th of the same year, with the same result. The jury in her trial took less than half an hour to come back.
Wow. So, first, her and a drug dealer got together. They go to rob a place with the goal that they're just killing anyone because they killed the officer, killed the 2 kids for really no reason, even after getting the money. So the plan was just to kill them anyways. They both get caught and both get sentenced to death. Saying what love can make people do.
With the guilty verdict, yet another first for former Officer Frank, the shortest deliberation in a murder trial in the state's history. Although she has lodged appeals over the years,
I would love to know what that is in the United States or Canada. In the US or Canada, what is the shortest time from a jury going to deliberate to them having a final verdict? What is the shortest time? I would love to know.
none of them have done anything to change her fate. She remains in prison to this day, and at the time of writing, she has the dubious honor of being the only female on death row in the whole state of Louisiana. In fact, the last time a woman was executed in the state was in 1942.
There's another scenario where people just sit on death row for ages. I still would love to know why is it that no one, they take so long to execute people. I've never figured it out. Is there a certain amount that can be done a year, or what is it?
When Tony Jo Henry went to the electric chair for the crime of murder, her lover and accomplice, Rogers Lacaze, has fared only slightly better. An issue with one of the jurors in his original trial led to a successful claim for a retrial, and this time, instead of the death penalty, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hard to say if that is much better. At the time of writing, Antoinette Frank has been in prison for nearly 30 years and is 52 years old. As a police officer, it should have been her job to protect the public and keep them safe from people like her lover, Rogers Lacaze, but instead, she assisted him in his crimes, killing innocent people, becoming just another criminal. Sometimes criminals and the crimes they commit can inspire others. So-called copycat criminals are a known phenomenon in the world of criminology, but other times they can find themselves memorialized, satirized, or at least partially responsible for the creation of fictional media. This could be the case when it comes to the life and crimes of Manuel Pardo. Born on September 24, 1956 in New York, Manuel Pardo Jr., who went by the nickname Manny, seemed to have a relatively normal childhood. As a young man, he was a Boy Scout, and then after school, he joined the Marine Corps. Manuel would then start to work with the Florida Highway Patrol. While his career in law enforcement began very well by any standard, he graduated top of his class after all. It wouldn't be long before a pattern began to emerge. He parted ways with his first organization towards the end of the 1970s, when issues were found with some of the tickets that he had been issuing to motorists. Essentially, he was caught making them up. This didn't stop him from being taken on by another police department shortly afterwards, again in Florida, but this time located in Sweetwater. Old habits die hard, or so it would seem, as he continued to have issues within his career, or with either his own department or other branches of law enforcement. He was found to have lied during an investigation within the force and was eventually let go from his job, and just like that, his relatively successful career in law enforcement would end, and his equally successful career in the drug trade would begin. In the year of 1986, Manuel would begin a spree of violence that
Okay, so this is going to be the case of he was an officer, but he's not now. He wasn't when the crime started.
would last only a couple of months, but would leave multiple people dead. After the fact, he would claim that he was a vigilante of sorts. That's all the lives he took were those of drug dealers and criminals. He would claim he was on a mission to rid the states of the scourge of drugs.
Oh, so he tried to paint himself as some vigilante? What the hell's wrong with him? That's insane. He take the drugs, then killed them. He'd be like, ha! I've saved the world from another drug dealer.
And was basically just a good person with pure intentions, doing his bit to rid the world of criminals. His first known killing would be in January, when he would rob and kill 2 men using a pistol. Later that same month, he would take the life of Michael Millett, a gunsmith who had previously sold Manuel equipment for his weapons. Michael was thought to be a police informant and was lured into a car by one of Manuel's former colleagues. Manuel was hidden in the back seat and would shoot him through the head, killing him instantly. The next month, he would take another 2 lives during a home invasion and robbery. Then in April of the same year, he would claim another 4 victims. The first 2 he shot and killed when they got into a dispute over some pawned and stolen goods, and many believe one of the pair was planning on killing him. His next victim was a drug dealer that had apparently gotten into the habit of not showing up at the arranged time. For this, quote, crime, Manny shot and killed both him and his girlfriend. When he went to hospital to get treatment for a gunshot wound he received during his final altercation, police arrested him after connecting the weapon that discharged into his foot with the one used in the last double murder. As well as professing his alleged, quote, mission of killing drug dealers and users, Manny would display both racist and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Nazi items found within his home would reflect his ideas.
Scared he too was marked for death. Apollo Garcia came forward to tell police about photos of the murder victim. The man showed off to him, and when detectives searched his house, they found disturbing Nazi memorabilia, including Pardo's dog who had a swastika tattoo on his leg. What the fuck?
Ideology. When in custody and later in court, he admitted to 6 of the suspected 9 murders and seemed to request the death penalty, requesting the, quote, glory of ending his life rather than being sent to prison for life. He got his wish when he was convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to death. The scale of the crimes that Manny committed gained enough coverage and notoriety that he found himself, or at least a potential version of himself, immortalized in a couple of pieces of media. There are some that look at the crimes of the wild and brutal Miami police officer and draw comparisons to the serial killer in the TV show Dexter, or the original character from the books they are based on. After all, Dexter Morgan works in Miami and uses his career as a blood splatter analysis to not only help him locate his victims, but utilizes his knowledge of police procedures to cover his tracks. It should be noted that Dexter in the fictional world he inhabits lives by a code where he only kills those deserving of death. Manny showed no such qualms. Also, the writer of the books that the TV show is based on, Jeff Lindsay, has never cited Manny as the real-life inspiration for him. A slightly more on-the-nose and less ambiguous reference can be found in the notoriously over-the-top, gory top-down shooter, Hotline Miami. Specifically in the sequel, Hotline Miami 2, a character named Manny Pardo, killed with reckless abandon, using his police job as a cover, and is obsessed with achieving infamy through his crimes. He was executed by lethal injection on December 11, 2012, in the Florida facility where he was being held, after all of his appeals had been rejected, and his last second plea of clemency had similarly been dismissed. Despite having a promising start in life, and serving his country in the Marines and later the police, Manuel Pardo threw it all away to carry out his, quote, mission of being a serial killer, killing those who he deemed to be even more evil than him. It's safe to say that history won't remember him as some kind of vigilante hero, and instead, he'll only be remembered as a psychotic serial killer. Sometimes people commit acts that don't just make the newspapers, they make the history books. crimes so heinous that they live on long after the person behind the actions has died, and sometimes ones that are simultaneously so barbaric and captivating that they get immortalized forever in a retelling in the media. Dennis Nilsen is a man who fits this category, one who became infamous as the Kindly Killer, and whose story was remade for the silver screen in the last few years in the UK, with David Tennant of Doctor Who fame playing the lead role. In reality, Dennis was born in Fraserburgh in the northeast of Scotland on the 23rd of November 1945. His parents were a local woman and a Norwegian soldier who had little interest in starting a family, but married and had 3 children anyway. The couple divorced after 6 years, and the children were raised by their mother with help from her parents. As a young boy, Dennis was fond of his grandfather, a North Sea fisherman who died while at sea, a loss that Dennis took very hard. A combination of being allowed to see his grandfather's remains after he had passed, followed by a near-drowning incident later in his childhood, have been theorized as contributing towards some issues in Dennis's psyche. In addition to these factors, Dennis struggled with his sexuality growing up. He began to think he was either gay or at least bisexual, and he was often bullied for this. He would join the army as a cook after finishing school, and was posted to Germany. Here, his habit of drinking to excess, one that would follow him for the rest of his life, began and grew. While he had never had any reported homosexual encounters during his various deployments, he began to obsess about the idea of having intimate interactions when the other party was either asleep or incapacitated. His fantasies began to move towards the possibility of a sexual partner that was no longer alive, one that truly had no way to either leave him or reciprocate. The final thing of note during his service in the army, before he retired from it at the age of 27, was that he had sex with a female prostitute during one of his last postings. In what seemed to be a final effort to decipher his sexuality once and for all, he came out of the experience certain that he was not heterosexual. After returning home, his sexuality caused a family argument, which ended up with Dennis relocating down to London and joining the Metropolitan Police. In London, he felt freer to experience the gay scene and began to frequent pubs and clubs that were known to be LGBT friendly. Dennis would spend only a year in the police force before retiring, and then after a few short-term jobs, he secured a position in the civil service. It was during this time of his life that after a few failed relationships, Dennis began to believe that he would never have a significant or long-lasting romantic connection. His darker impulses came to the surface for the first time in December of 1978, when he met a 14-year-old boy named Stephen Holmes. The pair drank together at Dennis's house and fell asleep, but in the morning, overcome with the paranoia that Stephen would leave, Dennis strangled him and then drowned him inside the house.
Oh my god, I know this case now. Once he said that part, I know this case now. Mr. Ballin told us about this case. I know of this case now. I know what this is. I'll let him talk.
In the body, pleasured himself over it, and then stashed it under the floorboards of his flat before burning it in his garden sometime later. The method of killing and the storing of bodies under the floorboards for some time, as well as his relative care with their remains, would become standard practice for Dennis while he was at this address. He would bring males back to his home, drink heavily with them, and then strangle and drown them before cleaning them up and storing them. On one occasion, he buried a body, only to dig it up multiple times and sit it in an armchair in his flat. When he was served notice to leave this location, he disposed of the last remaining body there and took up residence in another flat. Without private outside space to burn or bury remains, and even the inability to store them below the floorboards since he was on the top floor, his killing spree faltered for some time. Dennis would later claim that he would remember little to any of the actual murderous acts on occasion. He was that drunk at the time. As his victims were usually in the same or a similar state, he unbelievably had a couple of victims who he attempted to kill, but then aborted the attempt after they came back round. He managed to convince more than one of them that he hadn't been trying to strangle or drown them, only that they had gotten caught up in the bedclothes and he was assisting them. None of these men that nearly became victims ever reported their encounters to the authorities. The lack of space to store or later burn the bodies would not stop Dennis for long. Soon he had another victim at his flat, and he murdered them as well. He dismembered their body and flushed portions of it down the drains. This was a new ritual that he did a second time, and then, understandably, the drains began to get blocked. Whether Dennis was legitimately oblivious to what anyone investigator would find, or he'd forgotten what he'd put down the drains, no one can be sure, because it was him who phoned someone to come and have a look, and when they found bones and flesh in the lines from his flat.
Okay, they never said that part. Mr. Ball didn't say it was him that called and told anyone, hey, the toilets are clogged, and then they find the body parts of his victims. That's something else.
The police were called and he was arrested. He eventually gave a full confession to the police, complete with hand-drawn sketches of how he posed some of the bodies. Remains were found above his current address and previous locations. The trial was a national sensation, with every paper in the country clamoring to bring the latest on the, quote, kindly killer, who was a cold-blooded murderer, but also bathed and looked after the bodies of his victims. He was sentenced to serve life in prison in November of 1983, with a minimum of 25 years to be served. Police believe that he had taken the lives of at least 12 young men and boys during his spree. After serving just over a decade of his sentence, it was increased to a relatively rare whole life sentence, where there was no possibility of ever walking the streets again as a free man. Once he was behind bars, not much else was heard from him. It is known that he got his face slashed by another inmate while inside. Guards said that he became increasingly withdrawn and isolated as his sentence went on. An odd and fairly sad moment came shortly after Dennis was handed his life sentence in the courts and was shipped off to prison. His pet dog, named Bleep, had been held by authorities while they awaited the outcome of the trial. Dennis had gotten her from a local pet shop and named her Bleep since she seemed unable to bark, but only make high-pitched noises. In a move that feels a little harsh, Bleep was put down shortly after her owner began their jail sentence. The reasoning offered was that authorities didn't believe anyone would want to adopt a dog of a serial killer, but it...
I would've. The dog's not part of the crime. If the thing is not the dog ripped at people and ate people and attacked people, then I would adopt it. As long as the dog doesn't cause no problems, I'll be fine.
This reason, Bleep has sometimes been called Dennis's last victim, dying not at his hands, but it could be argued, by the result of his actions. He died in hospital in 2018 at the age of 72 of a pulmonary embolism. Except for prison guards, the only person who attended his cremation was a man named Mark, a graphic designer who had been pen pals with the killer since the early 90s. Mark was named as Dennis's next of kin and took ownership of what little possessions he had left behind, as well as his ashes. These he scattered at sea, in a move that was largely criticized by many as being too decent a farewell for a man who committed these crimes, but that Mark intended to serve as a sort of closure, to draw a line under the life of Dennis Nilsen and the lives that he had wrecked during his reign of terror. While he was neither a serving soldier or active duty police officer during the time of his murders, it feels fair to include him, as the crimes that he committed and the lives he took were so extreme.
Joseph James D'Angelo. You sound familiar.
Sometimes criminals are caught in the act. Sometimes investigations and gathering of evidence leads to their discovery days, weeks, or months after the fact, but there are also those who get away with their heinous crimes for years or even decades. Joseph James D'Angelo is one of the latter. Born on the 8th of November 1945
He looked like he was about to croak in that video, in that photo.
in New York, Joseph was the third of 4 children
Sorry, my nose is really bothering me.
in a family that moved around due to his father's occupation in the army. He would fit
It happens when I sit here, and I never know why. When I sit here, my nose will start to bother me the most.
finish high school, but according to those that knew him, he was already showing worrying behaviors even as a teenager, where he would rob houses and abuse animals. He would later claim that he witnessed one of his sisters being sexually assaulted at a young age while the family was stationed overseas, and other family members would say that their father also abused Joseph himself. He would join the Navy after graduating and did nearly 2 years of active service during the Vietnam War, before returning to the US and getting a degree in police science and then criminal justice. He would use this foundation and further training to join the police in 1973, working in the burglary unit. He was not exactly a stable man, judging by some of the stories that have been told by those who knew him. While working as a police officer during this 3-year stint, he found himself in some legal trouble after being accused of theft when he stole from a store. Eventually, this would lead to him being fired from the force, and, as any rational and well-adjusted person would do, he threatened to murder the chief of police when he was let go. In fact, it was reported by some that he was spotted staking out the home of his former boss in the immediate aftermath of this event. His romantic life seemed equally volatile. Prior to his career in law enforcement, he got engaged to a woman named Bonnie, but the relationship would end in divorce a year later. She described him as being abusive and reported that he used a gun to try and threaten her into marrying him. But when he got married in 1973, the same year that he joined the police, it seemed a little more stable. Together with his wife Sharon, they would have and raise 3 daughters. According to them, He was a textbook father, and neither they nor his wife suspected that he would commit the crimes he was accused of during this period of apparent home life bliss. After the police force, Joseph's main source of income was working as a mechanic, a profession he stayed in for the rest of his working life. However, during this period, there were a number of notable crime sprees across various areas, and no one was caught for committing them at the time. The first was known as the Visalia Ransacker, who was active from 1974 to 1976, and would break into houses. A total of over 100 burglaries were attributed to the unknown criminal, while most of them involved the taking of small value items and generally causing destruction in the properties. There was at least one occasion where a homeowner was shot and killed. The crime spree ended abruptly in 1976. Coincidentally, Joseph and his family relocated to Sacramento in 1976. The same year, an even more worrying series of crimes would begin. Sexual assaults committed by criminals.
Is this the one where the daughter looked up if he had done something? Or is that someone else? So I remember one case where the daughter looked up a guy who just happened to keep moving around at some point, and then he would get caught by it, but I don't know if that's this.
That was dubbed the East Area Rapist. Over the course of the next 3 years, this unknown man would attack lone women after staking out their homes and learning their routines, sometimes breaking into their homes to prepare by taking bullets out of guns and unlocking windows before attacking and raping them. When it was reported in the news that the rapist only attacked lone women, it seems as though his target switched to couples. Law enforcement investigating the crimes believed this to be a direct result of the criminal not liking the implication that he was targeting easy prey. His general routine was to threaten the couple with a gun and force the woman to tie up her male partner. He would then place items such as plates on the back of the bound and restrained male before taking the female to assault and promising to kill them both if he heard the items fall or break. In almost all circumstances, he was completely unhurried. It was reported he would spend a long time in each house, not rushing, and would even help himself to food and drink, as well as stealing some small and non-valuable items. In total, there were 50 crimes attributed to the East Area Rapist, before his spree would end abruptly in 1979. Again, coincidentally, this would be around the same time that Joseph and his family would relocate to Southern California. In 1979, a series of attacks and eventually murders began to take place in Southern California. After the fact, the man responsible for them would be dubbed the original Night Stalker, and there were a total of at least 13 killings directly attributed to him. It was during this spree, over the course of 7 years, that he would gain yet another nickname, this time the Diamond Knot Killer, for the intricate and tight knots that he used to restrain at least one victim. The spree would stop, seemingly abruptly, in 1986, and for nearly 2 decades, there would be no connection made between any of these 3 crime waves. It would be in 2001 when investigating officers began to see similarities in how the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker controlled their victims and the way they selected and then approached them, and they put together a worrying picture. Could it all have been one man? Looking back, some of his acquaintances noticed that Joseph was prone to discussing the ongoing mystery. While it would be expected that such a horrific crime spree would crop up in conversation among people local to the area, he apparently brought it up fairly frequently and took great joy in wondering who it could be. Looking back, and knowing that we know now, it has all the hallmarks of someone who is mocking everyone around him. His arrogance and confidence seemed to only grow as time passed, and the number of victims kept piling up, seemingly having progressed from home invasions of ransacking up to rape and finally murder, all the while without ever coming close to being caught out. He began to do what so many other criminals before him had done. He taunted the police. He sent them poems. He wrote them letters. He hand-drew maps. He made phone calls at various points over the course of many years, every time admitting that he was whichever name they had given him at that point and telling them in a very matter-of-fact way that they would never find him. And as the years rolled on, he seemed to be proven right. His name was never suggested in the wide net that they had cast for suspects. He was never pulled for a single lineup or dragged in for an interview. In fact, once the original Night Stalker's killing spree concluded in 1986, Joseph James DeAngelo simply stopped committing crime and slid back into society as if nothing had ever happened. The burglaries had stopped when he left the area, just like the rapes had stopped when he relocated from Sacramento, and, mercilessly for the public, the killings of the original Night Stalker just ended abruptly in 1986. While investigating officers were left scratching their heads, it didn't take long for them to think that maybe something had happened. Whoever was behind these brutal murders, had they in fact been killed themselves, been incapacitated in some way? It seemed odd, at least according to the profile they had generated, that this sort of sadistic and cruel killer would ever stop taking lives for no reason. Yet this is exactly what happened, and despite appeals, rewards, and many dead-end tips from well-meaning members of the public, each of the cases went cold. But a breakthrough was found through DNA, and not in the way you might expect. With the advent of genealogy services via DNA testing, many members of the public willingly submit samples of their own in order to find connections to relatives that they may not have known about, or even just find out more about the history that their DNA contains. When police compared the samples from some of these old cases, they found close but not exact matches in the database. Essentially, they realized that they were looking at the DNA of someone who was related to their wanted man, and after they narrowed down their search and focused in on Joseph, they got a sample from a discarded tissue and found a perfect match. After decades of mystery, they finally had their man. Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested in 2018, and when he was in the interview room alone, he was recorded saying the following: "I did all those things. I destroyed all those lives." He would go on.
I guarantee you, because I feel like it has to be the case, this guy never expected to be caught. When the police came to this guy's door, he had to have been so shocked, so befuddled. Not that they thought he did it, that they actually caught him at this point while he was alive. Because I guarantee you, he thought, he's like, they won't figure out it's me until I die. If they figure out it's me, it'll be when I die. Then they showed up at his door, he's like, oh shit. Then he went to police, he's like, yeah, I did it. I did all those things. I destroyed all their lives, I did it all. I just didn't think you'd catch me.
Trial for the 13 murders in 2020, and as part of a plea bargain where the death penalty would be taken off the table, he admitted responsibility for this.
At that age, I would have just asked for it. I'm like, look. Because they'd be like, we're going to send you a life in prison. I'm like, judging by how y'all do the death penalty, if I get there, it'd be life in prison anyways. I'm like 60 years old at this point. 60, 70 years old. If they won't be sitting there for an age, I'll die in prison either way.
Crimes as well. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In all, the police suspect that as well as the 13 killings, he was responsible for at least 50 rapes and more than 100 burglaries. He remains in prison at the time of writing and would be in his late 70s. I believe that I made the right choice by putting Joseph James DeAngelo last, as he was both a serial killer and a rapist who terrorized California for years and for decades escaped any kind of repercussions for his actions, all the while taunting the police, saying that they would never find him. And while he may have escaped the death penalty, he'll at least remain behind bars for the remainder of his life. I think it's safe to say that Joseph James DeAngelo may very well be the most evil man to have ever worn a police badge in the history of the United States, and may very well have been the most evil police officer to have ever lived.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for this reaction video. We have gone an hour and 26 minutes, and I've enjoyed every bit of it. Ladies and gentlemen, hit the like button, hit subscribe button, comment what you think down below. If you'd like to help me out with a donation, you can leave a super thanks, or link to my PayPal is in the description below. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all for the next one.